Let me put that in here. Okay, welcome everyone to our program this evening. My name is Kathy Poor. I am the chair of the League of Women Voters of Macomb County. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan grassroots organization working to protect and expand voting rights and ensure that everyone is represented in our democracy. We empower voters and defend democracy through advocacy, education, and litigation at the local, state, and national levels. Tonight, we are honored to host our guest speaker who will share her thoughts on how disinformation is sabotaging our democracy and what we can do to stop its spread. Please put your questions in the chat and we'll get to as many as possible within the next half hour. Barbara McQuade is a professor at the University of Michigan Law School, where she teaches courses in criminal law, national security, and data privacy. She's also a legal analyst for NBC News and MSNBC. She and her husband have 4 children and reside in Michigan. From 2010 to 2017, Professor McQuade served as the U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. She was appointed by President Barack Obama and was the first woman to serve in her position. She's been recognized by the Detroit News with its Michiganian of the Year Award, by the Detroit Free Press with its Neil Shine Award for exemplary regional leadership, and by Crain's Detroit Business as one of Detroit's most influential women. Professor McQuade is the author of Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America, and has a new book coming out in June. It is my honor to introduce Barbara McQuade.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. Good evening, everybody. Great to be with you. And I was delighted to accept this invitation for 2 reasons. One is I love the League of Women Voters. I think what you do is so critically important to democracy, always has been, but particularly important during these times when people are trying to attack our voting rights. And so sharing information, educating, all of that is so critically important. And the other reason I was delighted to accept your invitation is I'm from Macomb County. Great to be with all of you tonight. I'm glad to have the chance to talk with you a little bit about the book I wrote about disinformation, because I think we are living in a time when we have access to more information than ever before. But in some ways, um, we are living in our own information sphere and not communicating with each other. I think because of the way information is so now tailored individually to each of us. Um, so let me start by sharing with you some definitions. The term disinformation, it's a word that actually comes from the world of intelligence, and it means using false or misleading information, maybe even sprinkled with some truth, to advance some sort of agenda. It might be a political agenda, it might be a profit agenda, it might be a malicious agenda. Misinformation is a word that is frequently used synonymously with disinformation, but I tend to use the 2 words separately because I think they're different. I think disinformation brings with it a malicious intent, whereas I think misinformation is an innocent mistake that people make when they hear something, believe it to be true, and then share it with others. Russians have a word for this kind of person. They refer to them as a useful idiot. And certainly, all of us may have been guilty of being useful idiots at one time or another. But I think now that we understand the risks of disinformation, it's really important to all of us that we make sure we're not spreading misinformation. Um, it's funny, after reading this book, sometimes my kids refer to me as misinformation. Hilarious, you know. It's good to have kids to keep you grounded. Um, but there was a time that I am aware of where I trafficked in misinformation. I didn't do it intentionally, but I had read that Patrick Mahomes, the NFL quarterback for the Kansas City Chiefs, very famous. He's on a lot of TV ads and other things, makes millions of dollars a year. that he had posted online a statement saying that he was not going to play another down for his team, the Kansas City Chiefs, until they changed their name to something that was not offensive to Native Americans. And I thought, wow, that's great. Patrick Mahomes, way to take a stand. This guy makes millions of dollars a game, and he is going to sit out and use the power he has to pressure his team to do the right thing and change their name from Chiefs to something else. And so I, had to send that out there to the world and let people know that. And then only later did I learn it was a fake. And, he didn't really say this, it was made up. And why is this the kind of thing that people traffic in as disinformation? It seems so silly and so harmless. But I looked at the comments afterwards to uh, to to that post, and what it did was create division in society because there were many people who had posted, "Way to go, Patrick Mahomes! That's great. Way to take care of our Native American brothers and sisters." And there were other people equally passionate saying, how dare you attack this tradition, you woke leftist radical such and such. So the goal so often with this kind of malice is simply to stoke division between us in society. It has been one of the goals of Russian espionage for decades, and they have figured out a way to use disinformation to stoke division between us. Um, I think that if I have a thesis to share with you tonight, it's this. Disinformation, manipulation, propaganda has been around for hundreds of years. But what's different today, I think, are two things. One is the ability to use technology to reach so many people instantly all over the world. Any one of us can do it, and we can do it anonymously or using a fake name. That has created an incredible weapon. The other is we live in such incredibly polarized times when we see politicians pushing us uh, to, land into one camp or another. And I think there are things we can do to resist both of those things so that we can be empowered and that we can take power back for the people and share it with voters. So let me talk for a second about technology. Certainly, we've all experienced how the example I just gave, social media can be used to stoke division or share false claims. Um, the Robert Mueller report is something I share with my law students in my national security class at Michigan Law School. And that documents the way the Russian Internet Research Agency was able to use social media accounts to manipulate people by creating false accounts online, paying to boost their reach, and convincing people they were genuine to push and nudge public opinion. Now, here we are 10 years later, and we are seeing the use of artificial intelligence to be able to do these things. Fake videos, deep fake images of people doing things they've never done or never said, and yet millions of people will see these images and believe them to be true. So technology continues to be something we need to get our arms around. And we could do it if we wanted to, but the billionaires who own these tech companies give huge donations to the president and to members of Congress to stay away from regulation. But if we had the power of the people, we could find ways to regulate social media without falling afoul of the First Amendment. But the other thing I mentioned is this idea of polarization. And I think that's also a place where the League of Women Voters can make a difference. I think that members of both parties who try to push the electorate toward one extreme or the other have done something different in the past 20 years than they had ever done before. In the past, it was always the strategy to lean to the extreme end of your party in the primary season, right? For the Republicans, it was to the far right. For Democrats, it was to the far left. But when it came time for the general election, they all tacked back toward the middle to try to attract swing voters, independents, moderates to be electable in the general election. Since the 2000 election, when Karl Rove used statistical analysis to determine that that was a bad bet, politicians have done something different, and that is to remain at the outer edges of their party. Because what they've learned is that you win elections not by getting more moderates and independents to the polls, because after all, they might vote for the other guy. If those people are so turned off that they stay home, that's good because they might vote for my opponent. What I really want to do is motivate my base to show up at the polls. Because if my base shows up, I know they're going to vote for me. So, how do I do that? It's all about turnout. I need to convince people that this is the most important election of your lifetime. It is an existential threat if the other team, the other side, the other party gets elected. They eat your children. They are demons. You must not elect them. And then we have these elections. And then, of course, one party or the other is in office, and all the other voters who listen to all of this rhetoric thinks that that person is this demon who is filling the White House. One of the things they're doing is a tactic debaters refer to as the either or fallacy. That is, we really only have a choice between two things. It's far right or far left, Republican or Democrat, red or blue, and there is no nuance in between. And of course, the world is filled with nuance. But instead, we get this us versus them mentality. And right now, I feel like our country is really hurting because of the way President Trump is engaging in this us versus them mentality. They want to bring in immigrants. They are not like us. They eat cats and dogs. They are animals. And so, what we're seeing on the streets of Minneapolis with some of this political theater, it appears to me, immigration enforcement, I think, is an effort to just stake those claims of us versus them. They are these people who are anti-law enforcement, they're pro-immigrant. Just recently, President Trump, just this week, has started saying we need to nationalize our elections because of all the fraud. Of course, there has never been any proof of widespread fraud in American elections. But because of all the fraud, we need to nationalize our elections. Of course, the Constitution gives the states the power to run elections. And in my view, that's a good thing because it prevents any kind of hacking or cyber attack that could take out an entire nation's voting base. Instead, we have 50 statewide elections run at the local level, counties, which I think is what gives us that kind of decentralized security. But President Trump said we need to nationalize our elections because they are bringing in immigrants to vote for them because it's the only way they can win. In my view, that is disinformation. That is a false claim about the number one, it presumes that uh, Democrats are deliberately bringing in undocumented immigrants. There's certainly no basis to suggest that. And that the reason that's happening is so that they can vote. There has been no evidence that non-US citizens are voting in any sort of large numbers. But creating this impression, also in the past week, we saw a search warrant executed in Fulton County, Georgia. It would seem to me that the 5 year statute of limitations for any fraud that may have occurred in the 2020 election has expired. And so the idea that there would be some sort of criminal case seems time barred. We also know that back in 2020, the Republican Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, said there was no fraud in the election, that they had triple counted their ballots. There had been a number of lawsuits, and all of them concluded that Joe Biden had won that election. And here we are relitigating the election of 2020 as we are starting to prepare for the midterms of 2026 and the election of 2028. My fear is this is about getting more conversation out there about fraud in elections so that people don't have confidence in our elections. And if it is nationalized, of course, it gives the White House the ability to exercise some control over those things. And so this whole us versus them narrative, the idea that, immigrants are somehow less than, valuable as human beings than people in the United States. One of my favorite ones I'm hearing these days is you may know that there's a musical artist by the name of Bad Bunny who is performing at the Super Bowl on Sunday. He is Puerto Rican. He is a pop star. He sings in Spanish. And I have heard people say, why can't we have an American perform at the Super Bowl? Of course, Puerto Rico is part of the United States. So it is either deliberate ignorance or is pushing this whole us versus them mentality. And I think one of the things that's so disturbing to me is how many Americans are cheering him on. They like what they hear. I think they either believe what they hear or possibly don't care. What matters to them are other things like maintaining the status quo. Maybe they care about the stock market. Maybe they care about oil. I don't know what the issues are, but I think by stoking division and keeping people apart, it is one of the age-old strategies. If lower income white voters and lower income black voters and lower income Latino voters all got on the same page and voted for the same candidate, they could win. And so what do we do instead? We see this stoking of division between those two groups. If we can keep lower income white voters in a different side from black voters, Latino voters, and other people of color, then we can divide and conquer. And I worry that that is something that is going on. Well, that's a pretty dark picture, but I will offer you some hope. And I think we have a lot of hope, and people like you give me a lot of hope. There are things we can do to alleviate these problems. First is we can do a lot of things from the legislative perspective. How do we do that? We have to elect people who represent the interests of the people and not have the kind of gridlock or just sleepiness we're seeing in Congress right now, where not a whole lot is happening. But regulation of social media, it wouldn't take a lot to change some of the problems that we see online. And I think we could do these things without running afoul of the First Amendment. One of the things that is so problematic is that social media companies control algorithms. That's just the computer code that tells a social media platform what information should be lifted up and prioritized on your feed and what should be pushed down and deprioritized. And we know from Facebook whistleblowers that what Facebook does is push information and posts that are designed to generate outrage. Because the more outraged we are, the longer we stay online. And the longer we stay online, the more ad revenue Facebook can make. And that model is true with all of the platforms. So they crank up the algorithm to favor content that generates outrage. And so if you go online, all you see is a whole bunch of outrage and people getting mad at each other and arguing back and forth about things. We know that since Elon Musk bought X, he has been prioritizing accounts that relate to far right extremism. And so you see more of that. I know I post there and other places. I might post a completely innocuous thing about sports or about a Supreme Court opinion or something like that. And I will get all kinds of replies that are incredibly hateful from people. I don't know if they're real people or if they're simply bots or if they're AI generated, but it is the nature of the beast now on X because of the way that Elon Musk has cranked up that algorithm. But it doesn't have to be that way. We could have a federal agency, whether it is the currently existing Federal Trade Commission, whether it's the Department of Justice, or some other new cyber agency that we create that could oversee and conduct audits of these algorithms. They could make sure they are not being tuned in a way that is harmful to the public. Maybe they don't get shared publicly so that their competitors can get them. That makes sense. I get that. I once served on the board of a bank. Banks are subject to dozens of different regulatory agencies. And the reason is after the Great Depression, we created all these agencies and all these rules to prevent banks from becoming over leveraged and losing all of the money of their depositors. And so banks have to meet with auditors to show, yes, we do have sufficient savings to cover any withdrawals that might come in. Yes, we are making sure we know our customer so that we are not engaging in money laundering that might be against the law. We are careful not to lend money to groups that are flagged as terrorist organizations. Here are all our compliance plans, and we share them with auditors. Why can't we do the same with social media companies? And we can, is the answer. We can do that. I think anonymity online is problematic. That's another thing. When people don't know who is sending the message, there is the ability for people to pose as people they are not. That's one of the things we saw from Robert Mueller. People were posing as ordinary Americans with particular affinities. There was Army of Jesus posing as Christians. There was Blacktivists posing as a Black political activist. There was a coal miner group, Heart of Texas, um, Tennessee GOP, United Muslims of America, all these different groups posing as people when in fact it's just a bunch of guys in a boiler room in St. Petersburg, Russia, sending people messages to try to gin up support for certain causes or certain candidates and disparaging other kinds of candidates. We could pass a law that says you have to use your own name if you're going to participate on social media. Maybe you have to show ID to get an account. I think that would eliminate a lot of the problems that we have with people posing as someone that they're not. You may remember there was this cartoon in the New Yorker. It's one of my all-time favorite. You might see it on like calendars and tote bags and things like that. And it's two dogs who are on a computer. One's at the keyboard and one's sitting on the floor next to him. And one says to the other, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. And they're both wagging their tails and laughing about that. Well, the same is true, on the internet, nobody knows you're a Russian or you're a political operative. We saw in the last election a lot of mischief with disinformation, with people posting things with identities that were not their own. And so anonymity, I think, is something we should eliminate. Now, those are things that require, I think, legislation at the federal level, but there's an awful lot we can do right here at home and things we can do on our own by organizing. One is, I think that we need to improve our media literacy for our populace. And we have the ability to do that, conducting trainings at libraries or through civic groups, through League of Women Voters chapters. There are ways to do that. Finland has been very successful in developing media literacy in their curriculum. They, because of their proximity to Russia, have been at this for decades. And they train their children to look for some of the telltale signs of disinformation so that they can be critical readers and critical thinkers, maybe being skeptical of some of the things they read, but learning how to read and how to process information. That's really important. I think that we also need to redouble our efforts on civics education in American schools. We have cut back dramatically on civics education because instead we are focusing on STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math, which is important. I'm not saying it should all be civics education. We should absolutely be teaching our kids about STEM. But for every $50 we spend on STEM education, we spend 5 cents on civics education in America. And many school districts have no civics education at all. When you do not understand what the three branches of government are and how each is a separate and co-equal branch of government, and that checks and balances were designed into the Constitution to prevent any one of them, including the executive branch, from amassing too much power, then you realize how wrong some of these things are when we see them in the news. People who don't understand those things don't understand why the president isn't just the boss who gets to do whatever it is he wants to do. The founders and framers of our Constitution knew how dangerous it was to have a monarch that was all powerful. And so civics education, I think, is really important. And finally, the last thing I'll say, I want to wrap up my remarks here by 7:25 to give us a little time for questions, is starting with ourselves. There's a lot we can do. One is we need to keep an open mind with our friends and neighbors who may have believed some of these things that they have heard. We need to show them some grace. We need to listen to them. But I think we also have an obligation to share with them what we think is accurate and what we think is inaccurate. It may not be effective to browbeat them with information, but I think it is good to ask them, what is your source of that information? That's an interesting point. Where did you hear that? And I think if you ask enough questions, you may not win then and there. They may not even admit to you that you're right, but it may plant a seed of doubt in their mind about what it is they're reading or listening to or watching, and cause them to question whether they have accurate information. I think that we can uh, do other things like teaching ourselves good media literacy. And I've got some tips on how to do that in the book, and would be happy to share those with you if time permits. I'm going to stop there though because I want to leave some time for questions. So thank you, Kathy.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I'd like to just kind of go with what you just said about talking to each other. In your book, you mentioned social capital and Robert Putnam.
Yeah.
And even our league actually streamed his documentary about Join or Die, which is getting people together, even it might not be politically
Yep.
motivated, but talking to each other. If you could talk about that for a minute.
Yes, so important. And again, it's a reason I applaud all of you for being active and getting out there and uh, just connecting with other people. One of the things, that Robert Putnam writes about in his book Bowling Alone is how is as our society has advanced, one of the sad uh, side effects of advancements in technology and other things is that we are lonelier than ever. We are not spending time together. He attributed it to television. The name of his book, Bowling Alone, was that, people don't join bowling leagues anymore. But it wasn't just that, it was other things. People are not joining faith communities, they're not joining scouting, they're not joining civics organizations. I think some of it is probably because women are working and don't have the time to manage the household and cart their kids around. And so that's a new reality we have to face. But one of the antidotes for it is this idea of civic engagement, because when we don't meet people across difference, we might tend to believe some of these lies that we are being fed. That people hate America, that people are favor the rights of immigrants because they want to get an unfair advantage in voting. Not just that people have empathy and compassion for their fellow man. And so getting out there, I think, is really important to join something that you're passionate about. So all of you folks have joined the League of Women Voters, which I think is a wonderful thing. And that's a great way to meet people, to work together, and to advance a really important cause, which is the cause of voting rights and democracy in our country. So, but I think it was already bad in Robert Putnam's day. And then, of course, along comes the internet, the ability to work from home, to participate on Zoom, and the COVID pandemic, which, we're still climbing out of and has really caused a lot less engagement as people, work more from home or meet from home and don't leave their homes. And so I think the more we can encourage people to get out there and meet, and as you say, about anything, right? Coaching a kid's sports team or getting together for book clubs or going to the movies, whatever it is, just getting out and meeting people across difference is really important.
Thank you. Catherine, do you have any questions in the chat? Maybe a couple, one or two?
Yeah, we do have a couple questions in the
Okay.
chat. The first one comes from Hannah, and it says, in your mind, do you think it's productive to delete social media accounts or stay on it and try to promote the good accounts?
Um, I tend to think the latter. I think it depends on you. I know I have some friends who are on social media and they say it really gets them down to spend time on it. And, people talk about doom scrolling and those kinds of things. If it's having that effect on you, then maybe just getting out of it is a good idea. But I think that promoting good accounts is a great thing. There's a lot of really good information on social media. I find really interesting articles I might not otherwise stumble upon. I see interesting posts from people who are, smart and educated. Mark Elias is one who posts all the time about voting rights. I think that's a great account to follow. There are a bunch of good ones. And I think if we abandon ship, then it cedes the space to those who are engaging in either disinformation or, hatred, or other kinds of things. So I think if you can stand it, being out there, we don't want to spend too much time on social media, but I think it's great to be out there amplifying good messages, truth, good content.
Great, thank you. And another question here from Casey, who works for State Rep Mahjong as her legislative director in Lansing. And she asked, is there anything we can do at the state level legislatively? Like, what have other states tried?
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd love to see is for our states to really push civics education. I think that would be a great thing to do at the state level. I think any kind of education really is such a great way to begin to push back against things because every solution, I learned this in law enforcement. There's always a fraud scheme out there. And every time you catch on to the fraud scheme and you develop some new defense against it, there's another fraud scheme. And so it's important to keep chasing them. You want to be just one step behind and not 10 steps behind. So we always chased them and we always adapted. But I think one way to look at it is go to the other side of the equation, and that is to educate people who might be future victims and make sure people understand what's happening, what to look for, how to build resilience. And I think if we could introduce into, elementary, junior high, I guess middle school, high school curricula, civics education and media literacy, I think that would be a really great thing that could help us.
Great. We do have one last question here from Terry. Is there one red flag that could indicate you're being told mis or disinformation, like the always/never rule?
Oh, yeah, that's a good one. Um, I don't know if there's an always never, but what I would say is if you see something online, one thing that's really important is to do your best to check the source before you make assumptions about its authenticity. I think one of the things that the people who bought into a lot of the disinformation in 2016, we were living in a time when we thought that if somebody called themselves Patriot Girl 1776 online, that was a real American who was very patriotic. Um, and I think we've learned that, on the internet, nobody knows your dog. We need to verify the accuracy before we want to rely on something like that. And so I would say, go to trusted brands. I trust social media that is run by PBS. I trust National Public Radio. I trust the New York Times. I trust the Wall Street Journal. Don't love its editorial page. But I think there are, the BBC, I think there are some credible sources of information out there that I would rely on. It's probably still worthwhile to see if there's a second source reporting the same thing, because if something is newsworthy, it will be reported more than once. But I think too often people read things that come from, Patriot Girl 1776 or, War Eagle or whatever it is. Really important to make sure your sources are credible before you rely on something. I think I would share that as probably the most important rule.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your perspective. We really appreciate it. It was great meeting you.
Thank you, Kathy.